"This is too unfair." That's what Blake Snell said. Not after a bad start. Not after a rough outing on the mound. He said it after sitting in a chair, staring at a piece of paper, reading a list of names that the Los Angeles Dodgers had just handed to the baseball world. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down, looked up at the ceiling, and said words that very few people in professional baseball are willing to say out loud. "I can't trust my own eyes anymore." The room went quiet. It started with a meeting. 1 hour. That's all it took. 60 minutes behind closed doors somewhere inside Dodger Stadium, and when those doors opened again, the entire landscape of the 2025 National League had shifted. 8 relief pitchers were gone. The rotation had been restructured. And 2 names, Dalton rushing and Roki Sasaki, were at the center of decisions so ruthless, so calculated, that even veterans inside the organization had to stop and process what they were seeing. This was not a rebuilding move. This was not a panic move. This was the Dodgers telling the rest of baseball something very simple, very quiet, and very terrifying. We are building something that has never existed before. And at the top of that structure, standing above everyone else, was the name that has defined this franchise, this sport, and this era. Shohei Ohtani. But here is what made this announcement so much harder to absorb than anyone expected. It wasn't just that the Dodgers were loading up. It wasn't just that they were clearing space and making room and restructuring with the kind of precision that championship organizations operate with. It was that the moves they made sent a message, not just to their opponents, but to Ohtani himself. The Dodgers weren't building around him. They were building past him. Walk back to the beginning of that 1-hour meeting. Walk back to what the Dodgers knew going into it, what they had been watching, and what they had quietly been deciding for weeks before anyone in the media had the slightest idea. Ohtani had been carrying this team on his back since March. Two-way. Batting first. Taking the mound every 5 days. Absorbing innings, absorbing pressure, absorbing the weight of a franchise that had spent more money on one player than any team in baseball history. He had done it with a kind of calm that made the whole thing look easy. But the Dodgers front office had been watching something else. They had been watching the pitch counts. They had been watching the recovery windows. They had been watching the way Ohtani moved between his at-bats and his bullpen sessions in the days between starts. And what they saw, what they had been quietly logging and discussing and losing sleep over, was a ceiling. Not a failure. Not a crack. A ceiling. And they decided, inside that 1-hour meeting, that they were not willing to let that ceiling define October. So they made their moves. 8 relief pitchers. Gone. Not injured. Not optioned quietly during a slow Tuesday afternoon when nobody was paying attention. Gone. Replaced. Cleared out with the kind of decisive swiftness that front offices usually reserve for the trade deadline, not a random week in the middle of the season. The names that filled those vacated spots were not household names. Not yet. They were arms that the Dodgers had been developing, protecting, and saving for exactly this kind of moment. Pitchers with specific profiles. Specific pitch mixes. Specific roles within a bullpen structure that had been designed, meticulously, obsessively designed, to carry whatever innings Ohtani could not. And then came the 2 names that stopped everyone cold. Dalton rushing. Roki Sasaki. Dalton rushing had been waiting. Anyone who had watched him in the minors knew he was waiting. The stuff was undeniable. The delivery was clean. The ceiling, scouts had been saying for 2 years, was legitimate #1 starter territory. But the Dodgers had kept him back. Controlled his exposure. Protected his innings with a carefulness that frustrated some observers and confused others. The announcement changed all of that. Rushing wasn't being eased in anymore. He was being placed. Formally. Deliberately. Inside a rotation that the Dodgers were now describing, without hesitation, without qualification, as the strongest starting rotation in the world. Those were their words. Not a reporter's. Not a fan's hyperbole on social media at midnight. The Dodgers' own words. The strongest starting rotation in the world. And rushing was in it. When the news reached him, he didn't say much publicly. A few words. A quiet acknowledgement. But people who were in the room with him said his hands were shaking slightly when he held his phone. Not from fear. From the weight of understanding exactly what was being asked of him, and exactly what it meant that they had decided he was ready to carry it. Roki Sasaki was a different kind of story. He had come to Los Angeles with expectations so enormous that almost anyone else would have collapsed under them. He had not collapsed. He had adapted. He had learned. He had shown the kind of competitive intelligence that pitching coaches spend entire careers trying to teach and almost never fully succeed. But there had been questions. There had been conversations behind closed doors about his role, his workload, his place inside a rotation that already had Ohtani at the center of it. Those conversations ended inside that one-hour meeting. The decision regarding Sasaki was described by people close to the organization as ruthless. That word kept coming up. Not harsh. Not difficult. Ruthless. Because it was made without sentiment. Without attachment to the version of the plan that had existed 3 months ago. Without any loyalty to what was comfortable or familiar or safe. Sasaki's role was being redefined. His inning structure was being restructured. And the message being sent to him, quietly, directly, without any softening, was that the Dodgers needed something specific from him now. Not what he had been giving. Something more. Something harder. Something that would require him to become a different version of himself than the one he had arrived as. Whether he could do it, no one knew for certain. But the Dodgers had decided to find out. Blake Snell heard all of this from a distance. He was no longer in a Dodgers uniform. But he had faced this rotation. He had watched what the Dodgers were building from the outside, and he had his own understanding, hard-won, painfully earned, of what it meant to stand in the batter's box against a staff constructed this way. When someone showed him the announcement, he didn't respond immediately. He sat with it. And then he said what he said. I can't trust my own eyes anymore. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't bitterness from a veteran who had been left behind by a game that had moved on without him. It was something more specific than that. It was the honest admission of a man who had spent his entire professional life studying pitching, studying rotations, studying the way great staffs are constructed and deployed, and was now looking at something that didn't fit any of the categories he had built his understanding around. The Dodgers weren't following the template. They were rewriting it. And Ohtani stood in the middle of all of it. That was the part that nobody was saying out loud but everyone was thinking. The Dodgers had just announced the strongest starting rotation in the world, and they had done it in a way that raised a question nobody in that organization was ready to answer publicly. Where does Ohtani fit inside something this large? He was still the face. He was still the reason the stadium sold out. He was still the name that appeared first on every broadcast, every headline, every conversation about what the Dodgers were and what they were capable of. Nobody was taking that away from him. Nobody was even close to suggesting it. But the architecture of what the Dodgers had just built said something. It said that they were no longer willing to let any single player, even that player, be the load-bearing wall of their October structure. They had spread the weight. They had built redundancy into a system that had previously been designed around one irreplaceable presence. And that meant something for Ohtani. Not something bad. Not something diminishing. But something real. Something that he would have to sit with, and understand, and find his place within, the same way rushing was finding his place, the same way Sasaki was being asked to become something new. The Dodgers were not asking Ohtani to be less. They were asking the entire organization to finally be enough. The press conference after the announcement lasted 40 minutes. The questions came fast. The answers were measured, careful, and precise in the way that Dodgers front office answers always are, constructed to reveal exactly as much as they want you to know and nothing beyond that. But there was one moment. One pause. One question that landed differently than the rest. A reporter asked, simply, "Was this always the plan?" The silence before the answer lasted 4 seconds. Long enough to notice. Long enough for the people in the room to understand that whatever came next had been thought about very carefully. We knew what we wanted to build. We waited until we were certain we could build it the right way. That was it. No elaboration. No breakdown of the process. No names attached to specific decisions. Just that. And in that answer was everything you needed to understand about what the Dodgers had done inside that 1-hour meeting, why they had done it now, and why the rest of baseball, from the teams in the standings to the veterans watching from the outside, were sitting with a feeling that was very difficult to put into words. Blake Snell put it into words. "I can't trust my own eyes anymore." The Dodgers had just shown the world the strongest starting rotation in baseball history. And they had done it in 60 minutes.